So, welcome to our podcast series, Coaching Outdoors. Today I am unfortunately on solo. The west of Scotland is experiencing some, I think the weather's gorgeous, but technical problems. So Alex is unfortunately unable to join us. So it'll just be myself and James, our guest. And I would just love it if you could, we'll start again. I'm not doing well. Right, focus. Okay, so attempt 2. So welcome to our podcast, Coaching Outdoors. I am Anna Marie, and as you may know, if you've listened into our other episodes, I am normally joined by my co-host Alex. And though unfortunately something a little bit strange is happening up on the west coast of Scotland. It's not the weather, though there seems to be a bit of a technical glitch going on. So it is just going to be myself and our guest for the day, who is James. And I would love it if he could introduce himself to get us started.
Hi, Anna Marie. It's a pleasure to see you. I'm here on the beach in Brighton. Beautiful sunny day with no clouds on the horizon, so long may that last. I'm James Farrell, and I'm a coach and also an environmentalist. And I'm particularly interested in the place where nature and human potential interact.
And you just showed the view where you were kind of sitting out looking to the sea, which was the second time we've had one of our coaches on the by the beach before. So yeah, you can kind of look there towards Brighton Pier.
Indeed.
There's not a cloud in the sky. It looks gorgeous. Oh, the little one there. It looks gorgeous. And I'm outside today in Wiltshire from my camper van / office, and it has been a little bit damp, so I'm hoping we're going to be able to do this recording in between showers and we can both be outside. So we'll kickstart with a question that we like to ask all our guests, which is your memory. What is your earliest memory of being outdoors as a child? And then what is it about the outdoors that you enjoy so much?
That's a lovely question, isn't it? Earliest memories of childhood. And for me, I think it's probably walking to school with my mum in London, where I grew up, and visiting a hole in a wall, a brick wall. I can remember exactly where it is. And there was a spider that lived in this hole. It was probably a laceweb spider. And wanting to see that spider every day on the way to school and the way back again, and kind of proudly being able to find it and tell my mum about it. And that's a really striking memory. There's a whole bunch of others, but that's probably amongst the earliest, I think. And in terms of outdoors more generally and nature, I got a lot of inspiration from my mum and dad. My dad was a vet, so we had animals around a lot when I was a kid. I used to, go out when I was very little and dig for worms in the garden to feed the snakes and the slow worms and stuff. But he was also a surfer, and my mum was a swimming teacher, so I kind of grew up as a bit of a water baby in swimming pools, and then fell in love with surfing as I got older, and that's one of the main reasons why we moved down here to Brighton. So a big part of outdoors for me is being in water. But more generally, it's been part of my career, I suppose, and my profession originally as a conservationist, and always really in or around the environment.
I've just got this image of you kind of walking to school on the hunt for your spider, and then how that, years later has translated into this, love of nature, and how that's fueled, your future career and this interest in the environment. And it would just be really interesting to kind of join the dots a little bit and hearing more about your coaching backstory and how you then made that transition, to ultimately work in the coaching profession, but within the outdoor space.
Yeah, sure thing. So I'll be fairly brief. I mean, I started my career probably for the first phase of it, for the first sort of 7 or 8 years or so, in nature conservation. So I was pretty lucky. I did a degree, and after that I ended up working in some pretty amazing places. I worked in Borneo. I worked in I had my own island in Shetland I managed. worked in different parts of the UK, and then did a master's in nature conservation, and that's where I kind of fell in love with London again, and particularly London's nature reserves, which I did my thesis on. So that really sparked kind of the people dimension, if you like, of my interest in nature, and thinking about the fair access to nature, the interrelationship people have with nature and natural spaces, and the impact on them, but also the benefits we get from them. I then sort of second phase of career went and worked for Mayor of London for a few years, and worked in nature conservation, but also a range of other broader environmental topics. And again, that kind of deepened my interest in people and then in leadership. And for the last phase of my career, I've been working at a government agency, and again, looking at environment, but how organizations can change to be more effective at protecting the environment. And that was where I started coaching. So I probably started coaching about 5 years ago, something like that. And it's only been in the last maybe 2 or 3 years that I've really started going deeply into, firstly, kind of the science of human happiness and the science and evidence base behind how nature and human health interrelate. And I've set up 2 companies. So one is with my partner Lee Evans, is a nature connection business, looking at helping organizations and people connect better with nature, particularly in cities and towns. And secondly, my coaching practice, which I set up in 2019. And so joining those dots up, as you said, it seems to have taken me a while, but to make a personal practice intent around bringing nature and coaching together as a practice, as a way of enhancing coaching and also hopefully enhancing people and the planet by connecting them better with nature.
And it's really fascinating being able to connect with coaches who practice within the outdoor space and learn about their experiences and kind of trace this thread, which is, very much from childhood, and that kind of feeling and the memories, and then actually how has it shaped their future career. And very often, coaching is not a first profession. There's been something else. And then how is that other profession then kind of brought into the coaching dimension? And for you, having this kind of really deep grounding within the environment and within the nature, what that then brings into your coaching from that kind of aspect. And it would be kind of interesting to know how that kind of shows up within a coaching session. So when you're kind of co-creating the coaching process and you're working with a client, how do you kind of draw nature in? How does nature kind of work within that? And almost, a typical inverted commas session, what does that kind of look or feel like?
Yeah, there isn't one. And I relative to some other nature-based coaches, I mean, I'm relatively new in this as a practice, so I'm still learning my way through it and trying to find out for myself. So if you've got ideas, I'd love to hear them too. I think there's probably 3 broad ways in which, practically speaking, nature shows up in my work. Either, first of all, as a kind of a third chair in the room, if you're working with somebody, perhaps in a more traditional way, don't do so much face-to-face anymore, right? But on the phone or on a video, and you're both indoors, you can still do work that is informed by the ecology, the system of the planet and how we interact with it. And if you're not doing that to some extent, then I wonder whether we're really grounding actions in a way that is long-lasting. So that's probably the first thing. Nature-based coaching isn't just about being outdoors for me. It's about thinking about nature and how it informs the work that we might want to do indoors, if that's where we end up. Obviously, working outdoors with somebody face-to-face would be ideal. Very little of that at the moment, but I have done more of that in the past. So one of the things that I've been doing more of as a result of lockdown and the availability of face-to-face work is together, what I call together alone. So myself and a client in separate parts of the country, in our own local natural green space, connected by headphones only, working on coaching, but both with the benefits of being in outdoors. So that's another possibility that I'd encourage coaches to think about.
And within that kind of virtual together separate, that is something that through, you know, the last few months under COVID, I've shifted towards, and I've found it, and listening to the feedback I get from my clients as well, remarkably effective. And it is something different, and within this kind of day and age, how can we use technology? How can we bring the technology piece into the equation as well, and kind of bring nature to the front? And it's within kind of coaching outdoors, there is this whole kind of the nature dimension, the movement dimension. How much do we explicitly reference it, or how often is it more of an unconscious backdrop to the conversation? And this almost kind of segues into the next point about this kind of wider value of nature-based coaching. What is kind of like the ripple effect through the client, and how does it then impact their actions away from the sessions? And I'd just be interested to know, like, what observations, what experience have you seen through your clients on this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's an excellent question. You know, what's the evidence that this stuff is beneficial and works? I'll give you 2 or 3 examples, and then I'll probably talk a bit more about the evidence base, if that's all right, Anna Marie. I think it brings it to life if I tell a story, obviously anonymized stories. But the first one I'll describe was just using birdsong as a centering exercise with a client, both of us indoors, and how much the client benefited from that. But not only did they feel that it helped them have a better session because they were more relaxed, they're calmer, perhaps opening up their sort of trust and relationship centers, you know, less anxious, but that they've taken that on as part of their ongoing practice as a means of managing anxiety and promoting calmness and so on. So things like that we can do where we're bringing nature inside can be beneficial on their own. A second example is working with somebody, again, both of us indoors, using nature as analogy and metaphor. And the client was working through essentially growth and a long-term vision for where she wanted to end up and who she wanted to be, if you like, and brought this analogy around bamboo and growth rings in bamboo and layering those in and using that as a checkpoint. We were coming back, you know, session after session and exploring where that bamboo at the time. But what was interesting was that they brought their own, they sort of started to own this metaphor more and more, and it evolved and it shifted for them from a bamboo, one of many in a grove, if you imagine a grove of bamboo tree, to an oak tree, and this sort of stronger sense of independence and rootedness and visualizing different parts of the tree, meaning holding different things for the client. And that final feedback and the written feedback afterwards really drew powerfully on that metaphor. So nature had become, you know, visualization and sort of projection, if you like, onto a natural form had become kind of a way that they'd thought about themselves. And I think was really quite beautiful. And on a similar vein, I worked with somebody in London who was surrounded by London plane trees, and we used a London plane tree as a metaphor for different parts of the tree, beliefs, assumptions, strengths, values, embodied in this majestic life form. And again, that was so powerful for the client that it kind of came back session after session. And I'd be surprised, to be honest, if they walk around London and quite see the streets in the same way again. I think something as fundamental about identifying yourself with nature and the planet is something that I did never really thought about or come across before, and I think left a lasting impression. I think that there's a couple of sort of areas that I'd be really interested in hearing from others about in terms of how we evidence this. Evidencing the impact of coaching is really difficult anyway, isn't it? I measure a before and after affect scale using the PANAS scale, and you know, I'm very pleased that at the moment I can show that my clients are over 50%, have over 50% less negative emotion having worked with me than they had before, which is really fantastic. What I haven't measured yet is what the impact of the nature presence in the work has been. And I think if we can do that, I think there could be two really fantastic benefits. And these are underpinned by some science that I've got really excited about in the last year or two, which I'd love to share with listeners afterwards. And both of them relate to a bloke called Miles Richardson's at the University of Derby. And they're about measuring how nature connected people are, and then looking for ways in which that then benefits people and potentially benefits the planet. And two findings. One, there's now over 50 research studies that show that the more nature connected you are, the higher your life satisfaction. And in a way, coaching traditionally at least is, well, a big part of it is about that, isn't it? At least life coaching, about life satisfaction. How happy am I with my life? How satisfied generally with things? Now, why not do more work with nature if it helps clients in coaching achieve those ends? That's the first point. Second, his work has shown that the more nature connected individuals are, the more likely they are to take action for the planet. And the terms are pro-conservation behaviour and pro-environmental behaviour. And people are up to twice as likely to take those behaviours if they're nature connected than if they're not. So if coaches can connect more people to nature through their practice, and people benefit from that in terms of their life satisfaction, we're also more likely to have people that act for the thing they care and they love. And that's hopefully nature and the planet. So I'm really excited about the possibilities long term of us being able to show that nature connected, nature-based, nature-informed coaching might actually help ignite action for our world and not just benefit the individual.
Thank you for sharing those specific stories from working with your clients around, you know, the songbirds working inside, and the bamboo changing into oak, and then the London plains. And it is these little insights that, you know, our listeners can have that really brings it to life, and that kind of can be linked back into their coaching, and it's kind of tangible takeaways that they can implement. And just hearing you talk about this kind of this bigger picture with our coaching and tracking the actual changes, and ultimately we're looking at, you know, a huge shift in consciousness to being far more, you know, placing the environment and valuing it ultimately, and thinking about our impact in it kind of longer term, which we I don't know, in my opinion, we've got a lot of catching up to do. There's a lot of work to be done, and there's a kind of a couple of phrases that are kind of bounced around at the moment, and it's very much the shift from a ego-centric approach to an eco-centric approach. And thinking about our clients, it would be just wondering kind of what experience have you kind of had with this, and what have you kind of observed about the way that they think and the way that they behave and the way that they show up?
It's a really spot on question, really interesting. I haven't used the phrase eco-centric particularly, but I totally agree with the intention behind it. If it's okay, I'll give a couple of quick examples. I think I've got a couple that illustrate it really nicely of how a more nature-informed practice can help create that shift. Dog walker just walked past, it distracted me slightly. Somebody I was working with recently was really struggling with their kind of people please tendency, and their job involved working with some really challenging customers, and what they found was that they were going a bit easier than they should have done with those customers. Perhaps they should have taken a firmer line, and it was because of this tendency and this desire to try and please them. And the question I asked was, what if, you know, what's the role of the environment in this, or something as simple as that? And And it really made a real shift for this client to be thinking, actually, what if my job was the planet please rather than people please? And actually my place in this conversation with these customers is to do the best thing for the planet. And the absolute light bulb went off for her, and it really helped her see the value of her natural style and the good use of it, but also frame it around that bigger, wider set of goals than just the difficult conversations with those individual customers. That was, I thought, a really nice way of creating what you're describing, that ego-centric to eco-centric shift. And I've got another one scribbled down here, which was worked with somebody recently in the NHS, senior healthcare manager, another person who was drawn to help people, no surprise there, but really was finding it difficult to find any examples of how she might look after herself or return some of that love and care that she gives other people all the time, and include herself in that. And when we were coaching, I was asking her what she could see out of her window, and she could see, lucky enough, she was in a place where she could see a lake and a church on this lake and this landscape. And she had this realization that nature was going to give to her in the way that she gives to people. And so there was a kind of, not just in the first example, what can this person do for the planet, but also what is the planet then giving to the person? And she pledged as a result of that session to be, actually going out in the garden more, going out in nature more, watching that view more, looking at how it changed with the seasons, it changed with the minutes of the day and the weather, and appreciating what nature is giving her in the sense of that, calm, kind, compassionate place that she can be re-energized for when she goes back to work the next day, and she's giving back to her staff. So do those work for you, those two examples?
And they both really beautifully illustrate this very kind of fluid, dynamic, continual flow between ourselves and nature, and how we set ourselves within nature, because ultimately nature is a part of us. Though often we've become very cut off, divorced, removed, disassociated, and how we have, placed ourselves within this, if you think about the pyramid, the food, we're at the top of the food chain, and we kind of stand in the top on this kind of like golden tower. And how do we kind of turn ourselves inward and seek to, satisfy the ego at the expense of, so much else? And again, having those two examples, they are really something that it gives you a visual image. As you were describing the lake, I was there myself, looking out the window and seeing the lake. So they were both really concrete examples. And
coronavirus is it's a huge, clearly a moment in human evolution and the evolution of our cultures and our way in which we see ourselves as part of, as you say, part of this tiny blue dot floating in space. And what an opportunity! I call it a massive threat, clearly, but also what an opportunity to reposition ourselves and step away from some of that egocentric view of the world that's got us into a lot of the messes we're in. Frankly, we can't go about imagining that we're somehow different from nature, separate from it, above it, in that top of that pyramid, because it's, things like coronavirus show us it's absolutely not true.
It's a poignant reminder, and very much bringing it back to this, the ecological system, and how do we fit within it, and how are we connected, what are the networks. And that's just a total shift in thinking. And when you look at a lot of organizations and the way that organizations are structured as well, is that hierarchical kind of structure comes through again and again. And actually, how can we move beyond that? What are other ways of being and doing? And it's as coaches, we kind of need to balance things. There's the nature and environment, which when we're bringing this into the conversation, how do you balance that alongside the needs of your coaching clients?
Client-centered, whatever the client brings is the thing, you know, whatever matters to them is what matters, etc. And there's a lot of that I agree with, but at the same time, we don't operate, as I said earlier, in a vacuum, in the top of the pyramid, isolated from everything else. So I've got a set of values and beliefs. I wouldn't want, as a coach, to role model somebody who is devoid of those or can completely discount them, which is, I think, feels a bit like an extreme version of what person-centered coaching might be if we're not careful. But you know, but I think I'm always mindful that the work I do must be in service of the client as well as, because if it's just my stuff, I think there is a risk to whether this is coaching anymore and whether this is teaching instead, which has a place, but let's not call it coaching. So I think I think you just have to go with your gut. I think you have to be able to just, you know, describe a framework for yourself, if you like, and some boundaries. And if a client doesn't want to talk about the environment in a session, that's perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned. You know, I think my intent is to do nature-informed work, but it needs to be the right work for the client in order to create the change the client wants. So, bit of a long answer, basically, to say it's a tricky balance.
And it is. It's like walking that the tightrope.
Yeah.
That, okay, so, you know, these are my values. So ultimately, you're working with a client, and you are in service of them. And yes, you're not there to teach. That's not what we are. We're not teachers. They were not there to collude and just agree. We're there to challenge. So how do you actually do that? And, you know, have an element of stretch and push the boundaries, though, to ensure that the client still feels safe within that. But there is still an opportunity to grow. And it comes down to how much do you actually reference nature. And I have some clients where it's not actually explicitly referenced, whereas with others, there's just total richness and gold in the metaphors that are coming through. So it's a spectrum, it's a dance. And how do you kind of place yourself within that? And how do you have, again, I come back to the word fluidity. How do you have that fluidity to kind of flow in the moment? So that you are kind of getting that balance. And, you know, we don't always get it right, you know, hands up, I've not. And that's part of the learning experience as coaches, how we kind of refine our practice.
You're right. And there's another risk, isn't there, which is that we might just end up working with the converted. So, you know, we've got massive inequities in access to nature, massive inequities in sort of environmental justice. So how do we democratize all of this so that we aren't just attracting the kind of people that already get it? They've got a big garden, or they've got a car, they can drive back to the countryside. I mean, that's a personal choice for all of us as coaches, but I think I'm interested in how do we get the right balance so that it can work at people, it can work with people where they're at. And in the process, perhaps, you know, help people understand their connections to the wider world, but in a way that makes sense for them. So that's something that I've kind of got in the back of my mind a lot of the time.
Yeah, it is. It's whether we're kind of preaching to the converted or actually reaching out to others who are potentially curious and are open to receive. And you know, within the coaching profession itself, this is still the whole environmental element. It's new. There has been the Coaching Climate Alliance, which was established in late 2019 itself, you know, only a year ago. This is kind of demonstrative of this kind of growing interest. Within this increasing interest within the environment, this has been replicated within the coaching profession, and this can be demonstrated through the establishment of the Coaching Climate Alliance a year ago. And within this, I'd be curious to know, you know, what do you hope for the future with this movement, and then kind of bringing it back to the individual as coaches? What can we do to support it?
Okay, yeah, we definitely need to give props to the Climate Coaching Alliance, but also to, I think before that, there were the climate coaches. Charlie Cox was organising, and Extinction Rebellion had a coaching network few years ago. So there's been a few activists in this space, absolutely brilliant amount of energy and enthusiasm. I think the impact's been, you've got bodies like the International Coaching Federation now signing declarations on climate, as well as on race and Black Lives Matter, which has been, bloody hell, too late, a little bit too late, or would have been nice a few years ago. Yes, absolutely. I think anyone who's listening to this should join the Climate Coaching Alliance. It's a fantastic place to work through some of the questions that you've been asking actually today. And I think our very own Prime Minister said that climate change and biodiversity were two sides of the same coin. So anyone interested in the nature side of things is equally likely, I think, to be interested in climate. I'm just getting stalked by dogs at the moment.
You've got some friends there coming to join you.
Sorry about the flow.
Oh no, that's what it's all about. That's why we want to be outdoors, and it really, in a way, illustrates, like, when you head outdoors when you're working and having a conversation, you never know what interruptions may happen. It's just part of it all.
A pigeon and a carrion crow here as well, so it's all happening right in seafront.
The place to be.
Yeah, so the first thing is definitely link up with these networks and climate. I'm interested in whether or not there's appetite and desire to connect people more specifically working in nature as the flip side to the climate change coin. So if anyone's interested in that, they can give me a shout. And I think that's about thinking about your work, your business, your practice, your offer, your market, isn't it? And how do you take on some of these concerns and express them through your work in your own way? So that's something I've done, setting up the Natural Coaching Company. But it's something that coaches perhaps in a more traditional, perhaps executive leadership coaching space or life coaching space could think about for themselves. The second thing I'd say is, as coaches, we know the importance of educating ourselves, because that's how we become coaches in the first place, right? We read about whatever it is, Gestalt or transactional analysis, and the same holds for nature and climate. So educate oneself. And there's two things I'd probably signpost to people, and you can stick them in the show notes. I mean, the first is learning from ecotherapy, which has been around this block for years before coaches came onto the scene. And in particular Martin Jordan, who sadly passed away, but is a lecturer here in Brighton, who's written at least 2 books on ecotherapy, and those are really, really useful. They're quite intense, they're quite academic, but they're really fantastic grounding and source for other references. And then I think in terms of plain English descriptions of why it's important to connect to nature, I point people to the Finding Nature project, which is linked to Miles Richardson, the University of Derby, and he has a blog, and really nice, digestible for the lay audience, but really fantastic evidence base to draw from as nature-based coaches. And then the third thing I'd say is I think we should think about our own impact. Obviously, we should be acting in a way that treads more lightly on the planet as individuals and as families and as communities. I think what's the role of coaches and how they consider the impact of their coaching business. So one of the things that I do, for example, is I give away 2% of profit to climate change, and I do this through what's called Gold Standard, which is international, independently assessed way of retiring carbon credits from the trading scheme. And for each ton of carbon you buy, essentially, it tells you exactly where that's going in the world, what it's delivering in terms of social equity, nature, climate reduction, and it's a really fantastic way, I think, personally, for me to show that yes, I want to do good work and I want to benefit the clients personally in terms of progression, but also I'm prepared to give something back as part of more than an offset, actually, as a contribution to climate change. So those would be the 3 sort of things I'd suggest people did. And if anyone wanted to find out more about some of the things that I've mentioned today, I've got a short guide to why coach with nature, which I'm happy to link people up with.
And thank you for signposting those various resources, and we'll make sure that they are all popped into the show notes so that people can link through to them and clearly kind of reach out to you as well. And the way that you were talking there about that kind of wider environmental responsibility for your business, and actually how can you give back, how can you contribute, it's something that I'd really encourage all kind of coaches to do, whether that's under the the umbrella of sustainable corporate responsibility and the like, or just how do you ultimately from a business perspective give back. I know that for me, the way that I've chosen to do that is to commemorate the ending of each coaching partnership that I have through planting of a tree. And that's either with the National Forest within the UK or Tree Aid, and they work in a variety of kind of different countries within Africa. So for me, it's a symbol as well. It's that metaphor of growth of a tree, that okay, so our coaching partnership may have finished, but we are still growing, we're still evolving. And I just think it's a really interesting question that you can pose yourself. Okay, so how do I want to be remembered? What is the coaching for? How does it connect to something bigger, whether that is through offsetting carbon, planting a tree, or something completely different? There are so many different opportunities out there, and I think we can be really kind of quite innovative about it so that it aligns with our values, but also kind of represents something that's important to us as an individual, and it becomes part of your brand, part of your marketing as well, as you're kind of sharing that. And it's, in a way, it's an education piece. It's helping to raise awareness as well, so it covers so many different levels, and it's something actually from a business perspective as coaches we should be really investing in and taking our time to consider.
Yeah, good.
So just you've mentioned some amazing resources there, which I'm sure our listeners would love to kind of dig into. Just before we kind of pull everything together, if there's any others, and then clearly it would be great if we could just kind of signpost where our listeners can reach out and find you. We've touched on some really fascinating topics here that they're tricky, they're complex, we don't have all the answers, we're all kind of working through this together. So ultimately it's all about continuing the conversation because we don't have the answers.
Yeah, I agree. Well, it'd be lovely to hear from people as well. So you have a link to my website, and if people join the community there, I occasionally send things out aiming for them to be useful to people rather than filling up inbox with junk. But people that do join the community can have access to a page with some resources on it, one of which I've mentioned is a guide to why coach with nature, which includes some of the science and the evidence behind why it's worthwhile. A webinar that I led recently for the Climate Coaching Alliance is linked through to there as well. And I'll make sure this podcast is on there too, so that we spread the news about your good work, Anna Marie. So if people drop me a link through there, then they can have all of that. And of course, my email address, which I'm happy for you to pop up on the site as well if people want to get in touch directly.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And clearly, we'll have up with this podcast, we'll have a link through to your website. And it would be great, at some point in the future, always keen to kind of get people kind of back on. Obviously, this is evolving, this is changing, this is just kind of starting things. And within the whole coaching framework, we're looking at a lot of different themes, and this environmental action and nature one is absolutely key and paramount. And I'm really excited about where it's going to be going over the next year, 2, 5, 10 years. We're in this for the long game. And it's all about kind of raising awareness and collaborating together. So no, I'd really just like to, thank you so much for giving up your time and sharing your knowledge and stories and expertise today, and linking it to the evidence as well. That is important to kind of get it evidence based. And I know that Alex will be really disappointed to have missed out, and she'll be looking forward to kind of diving into the recording. And so yeah, a big thank you from me.
You're welcome. It's been lovely to talk to you, and keep up the fantastic work you're doing with this pod. It's great to keep spreading the word and bringing people on. Perfect.
And I'd just like to remind our listeners, if you're hunting out future podcasts, do go and check out coaching-outdoors.com, which is where you'll have found this one. So you probably know where it is already. But just as a reminder, it is coaching-outdoors.com, and we I've got a load of amazing guests kind of coming up. So look forward to hearing your feedback on what you thought this is all about, starting the conversation. Thank you for listening.